We need to figure out how to decrease the power that police officers have over Black women and girls and women of color. Black women are stopped, profiled, beaten, assaulted, falsely charged, held on bail across the country every single day. Taking away the tools that police officers are able to use to justify force, criminalization, and the power they're able to hold over Black women and women of color, and creating conditions under which we can not only survive but thrive. My name is Andrea Ritchie. I'm a Black woman, a lesbian, an immigrant, and a survivor of multiple forms of violence. I say those things because they might all not be immediately apparent, but they all deeply inform the work that I do. I was living in Toronto and the Rodney King non-indictment came down.
I hope you find in hell, you piece of shit!
And there was one of the largest protests in Canadian history. And around the same time, 2 Black women experienced police violence. One named Audrey Smith was a Black Jamaican woman who was standing on a street corner at 1 in the morning, and police officers just walked up to her and ordered her to lift up her shirt because, as they said to her, they said she looked like a drug dealer. And another Black Jamaican woman was shot by police and paralyzed. You know, Black women were organizing around all 3 cases, and it seemed like the rest of the world, the mainstream, was mostly talking about Rodney King and not about Audrey Smith and Sophia Cook. And for me, as the daughter of a Black Jamaican woman, those cases particularly struck me because it felt like they could have been my mother, my sister, my cousin, my aunt, my grandmother. And so it felt equally important to me to talk about all forms of police violence against Black communities and all subjects of police violence against Black communities. I think women of color's experiences of police violence are invisible for a number of reasons. I think one, violence perpetrated against Indigenous women, Black women, and immigrant women has been invisibilized throughout most of this country's history. For many years, rape of Indigenous women or Black women wasn't seen as a crime at law. It was systemically perpetrated through colonial violence and through chattel slavery, violence against Black women, ripping them away from their children, sexual violence, forced pregnancy were instrumental, central, that they were part of the institution of chattel slavery. Sexual, physical, and fatal violence were instrumental against immigrant women, was instrumental to establishing and maintaining this country's borders, and that's been invisibilized in the story of how the U.S. was built. So it's not surprising that police violence would also be invisibilized. And then officers target people who they think will be less likely to believe if they do come forward, or who are less likely to come forward. So for instance, recently in the news, there was a case of a police officer who was sexually assaulting a 4-year-old girl, and her mother was undocumented, and the officer was using the threat of deporting the mother to stop her from reporting his behavior. She reported it anyway, but many, many, many other undocumented women talk about being routinely targeted by police officers for sexual violence.
No, we're done. We're done. You're under arrest. We're going. We're done.
So when white women like the nurse in Utah, Alex Webbles, who refused to draw someone's blood without their consent because they were unconscious, you know, when the police officer ordered her to, and the police officer roughly arrested her, there was just a national outcry, and there was no question that what the officer had done was wrong, that his manhandling of her was wrong. She was immediately offered a $500,000 settlement without even filing a lawsuit, whereas when Black women or women of color are killed, the automatic assumption is that they were somehow at fault, they somehow posed a threat. And so there's also this perception that Black women's mere presence in public space and Black women's voice and sort of protest of any discrimination is also experienced by police officers and people calling police as a threat in and of itself, and as something that has to be met with physical force or arrest or even fatal violence. Sandra Bland's case definitely catapulted Black women as targets of driving while Black onto the national consciousness. She was driving along a highway in Plainview, Texas, saw flashing lights in her rear view, and pulled over. And then in the course of the 3 days that she's in the jail, she's found hanging from what was a garbage bag in her cell. Many black women saw themselves in Sandra Bland, that there was a hashtag, saying what happened to Sandra Bland, and if I die in police custody, know that I didn't kill myself. And I'm just sad to say that there are so many other Sandra Blands. 5 black women died in jail cells that they couldn't afford to bail themselves out of the month that she died. At a march in the wake of the non-indictment of the officer who killed Eric Garner, they had a poster with pictures of black women and girls who had been killed by police, and were noticing that the chants in the crowd focused entirely on Eric Garner and Mike Brown and other black men who had been killed by police.
Eric Garner! Eric Garner!
And so I think they just started chanting the names of the women and say her name afterwards.
Say her name! Charlene! Say her name! Lena!
And they sort of coined the hashtag around that time. We don't know how many women of color or girls of color have been killed by police violence because we don't keep that data, just like we don't keep data on how many women and girls have been raped or sexually assaulted by police officers. So we rely on media reports, which then, we're at the mercy of what the media deems newsworthy and who the media deems newsworthy and how they cover the story and what they tell about it. Some research shows that every 5 days, a police officer is caught in an act of sexual misconduct. That's a pretty frequent number, and those are just the officers who are caught. And one study that I read that demonstrated that most police officers know what's happening, and they just don't report it. And it's part of this sort of blue wall of silence where people don't agree with it necessarily. They don't feel even as conflicted about it as they might feel about use of force, where they're like, well, maybe he did feel threatened, maybe she did feel threatened in that moment. They know it's wrong. They just let it happen. I think that when you look at policing through the lens of the experiences of women and queer and trans people of color, you get more quickly to the place where maybe tinkering with this system isn't going to get us to safety and to an end to all forms of violence against black women and women of color. If the person who we are saying is supposed to be the protector of women and children, the police officer, is perpetrating violence against women and children, then that calls into question our whole vision of safety and the means we devote to achieving it. It's something that we have to focus on preventing, detecting, and ensuring accountability for officers for sure. I want us to think differently about police violence and policing and criminalization and the ways it impacts our communities. My goal is for us to really put the safety of women and girls of color and queer and trans people of color at the center, and then build our notions and visions of safety around making it safe for us, and then I think the world will be safer for everyone.